All right, so this is attempt at recording after class for 1020's Tuesday class. Well, I believe it was the 8th or the 9th of February. We are going to be talking about a time period from the 1500s to roughly 1750, a time of reform and rebirth. So again, I apologize for having to remake this after class. Apparently my computer memory was quite full, so I had to get rid of some files to make some new recordings. Either way, I'm going to speed through these notes, so hang tight, hit the pause button when you need to. Either way, we'll make it work. With the social restructuring of Europe that was started by the Black Death from around the 1340s on, new forms of government would begin throughout the various kingdoms and states that now make up Europe. Many conflicts in this era, which we will call and other historians have called Europe's struggle for stability, originated as religious conflicts centered around the Great Schism that had happened with the Catholic Church in 1517 officially, but there had been rumblings before then where the Protestants, in the form of Martin Luther originally, would split from the Catholic Church. Encouraged by what he saw as immense abuses of power by the Catholic Church and its clergy, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door of the the Wittenberg Church, to the door of that church in 1517 on October the 31st. Now, if that was in reality him physically nailing some notes onto a door, or if that was, a metaphor that was created over time for him declaring with his 95 Theses that he had a problem with the way that the Catholics were both acting as clergy and running the church all the way up to the top. So, his 95 Theses, and the Protestant Reformation that began therewith, sparked a time of formation and reformation within Europe, within the religious circles. However, as a growing number of autocrats throughout Europe were actively seeking ways to lessen the power of the Catholic Church in their own countries, Protestantism would spread for many reasons, both religious and for, let's just call it, fiscal reasons. Either way, to ensure their powers and continuing reigns, a number of European monarchs began to more actively create standing armies. We'll see this running throughout a lot of the monarchies of the time, thus ensuring that they had a ready fighting force that could defend a government without delay of militia summons, or a rebellion when harvests were in and your militia, had to go back and return to their families to harvest their grains or else potentially starve the following year. So militias had their drawbacks. Thus, you see, to ensure a stronger empire that are growing popular at this time in Europe, you have to have a stronger standing army. To fund these standing armies, a new reliance on higher taxes became very common. While these taxes were definitely collected from all, rich and poor alike, a new noble class largely became responsible for a monarch's bankroll. So, as we'll talk about later a bit more, autocrats, by their nature, are supposed to rule with the authority of just themselves, right? Autocrat, single ruler. In truth, they rule with the consent of typically the noble class, as we will see again several different examples throughout Europe's history here. But bear that in mind, that effective autocratic rulers rule with the consent of typically the noble class. To best use the taxes, which, again, is a very rare trait in any government, using taxes correctly. Stronger bureaucracies started forming within the different governments, and different bureaucratic levels existed within these governments. However, their growth in importance to relation of the autocratic rulers changed greatly in favor during the 16th century, to the favor of the nobles, rather. We will see by the mid to late 17th century, the power will have gone back primarily to the kings and the queens, the monarchs of Europe. So, this roughly 200-year stretch would raise, and still does raise, many political questions throughout Europe, the answers to which still affect the governments in Europe today. Some questions raised are, how does an autocrat come to power? Well, several different ways, as we will study. How does that autocrat maintain their power? Again, we will discuss this. How did the civil and international wars, and again, many of them were religiously inspired, that Catholic Protestant split that we're going to discuss here, how did those interactions, those wars, come to shape the progress of autocracy and its eventual evolution into more republican forms of government that, more modern world is familiar with. We're also going to discuss how early colonialism throughout Asia and the Americas, again, Africa would come in about a century and a half later, when Africa was being taken as part of the Europe's colonial empire. So Asia and the Americas became the focus of Spain and France, England, the Dutch Netherlands. And while they expanded their empires through, starting colonies in different places that did not touch their original kingdom, we will see how Russia and their building of an empire and the methods that they built it with were different, and how that resulted in a different outcome. So the Russians, instead of building colonies from afar, far away from the central point, expanded their own contiguous borders. So as we will see, benefits and downfalls to both. We'll get there. While politics were evolving in their own ways in these different places, ideas and goods, diseases, remember diseases especially, all followed along the now worldwide trade routes. Again, we're talking post 1492. The Columbian Exchange has really, begun and is running full steam ahead. The world is now confirmed to be very round, and trade routes have been established that go all the way around. So with that, there is again an increase in trade in not only ideas and goods, but the all-important diseases. We'll get deeper into that later on. Because trade was so ubiquitous, and again, worldwide trade routes, it's kind of hard to say which of these kingdoms would be considered, the wealthiest, the best. I mean, wealth is measured in different ways, but they all had more or less equal exposure to the same goods, relatively speaking. So again, that's the end of that section, kind of the summation for the chapter. I would recommend subtitling your notes, The Protestant and Catholic Reformations. There was a great stand-up comedian I used to watch a lot as a kid that said, Martin Luther must have said something like this in German: "Eine Minuten bitte, ich habe eine kleine Problemo mit deiner Church." Kirche is church in German, but he forgot that in his stand-up, and I've always thought that was funny because, again, whether it's metaphoric or real, Martin Luther announced that he had a huge problem with the Catholic Church and their practices when he announced his 95 Theses, whether he nailed them to a door or not. So, again, October 31st, 1517, Wittenberg, Germany, or what would be Germany, still the Holy Roman Empire at this point. The Protestant Reformation. And so it begins, our notes for this chapter. This separation and renouncement of the practices of the Catholic Church was kicked off again by, I believe he was a teacher, professor at the local university in Wittenberg, Martin Luther, in 1517. So again, I emphasize the date, October 31st, 1517. This event would lead to the splintering of Western Christianity. The Protestant Reformation would, or formation as I prefer to think of it, because, you can't reform something that's brand new. You got to form it first. So this chapter is called the Protestant Reformation. So does all of history call it that? In my mind, it's always clicked. I call this the Protestant formation for whatever reason. Sidetrack. Back to the notes. The separation, as this was, again, kicked off 1517, would lead to the splintering of Western Christianity and would be the cause of many, many wars. The 30 Years' War among them, and we'll get to that later in the notes. Religion became a motivating factor to act on pre-existing political and social unrest that had been growing ripe in these European kingdoms for a long time. As we will see, environmental factors like the Little Ice Age, reduced crop numbers, increases in things like the plague and other diseases, malaria, cholera, etc. All of these would, cause a lot of social unrest. The lower, rungs of society are not taken well care of by the upper rungs at this point. And, they start feeling like no one's looking out for them. They have no help, and they now can't they can't feed themselves. And when that happens, family size keeps getting smaller, populations decrease, and eventually social unrest will, in large part take hold. Either way, getting ahead of myself again. The concept and name of Reformation comes from the desire by early figures like Luther and Calvin to reform the Catholic Church. and the abuses and powers that the Catholic Church had accrued over the time. The corrupt nature of the Indulgences, which is basically a get out of hell free card that the Catholic Church would sell to lay people for certain amounts of money, weights of grain, etc. It was you paid for your forgiveness. It's made the local church and the big church, big Catholic Church back in Rome, very wealthy. It's one of the main things that Martin Luther had a big problem with. So indulgences, bad. Clerical absenteeism, he had a big problem with that, and that is where, say, a bishop would be appointed to multiple positions within the church, meaning he would need to be physically in 3 different offices at the same time. Well, obviously, that would be impossible. So that bishop would appoint lower clergy to go and sit in those offices for him, and he would take a cut of that pay or give them a small cut of his gross pay. So either way, big corruption, obvious. Immorality. So again, we'll get to this more in depth in just a second, but let it be said that the Catholic priests and all the way up to the Pope at the time were not known for sticking to their codes of celibacy. A lot of them had a general ignorance of their own religion, if we're being entirely honest. All of these were common complaints lodged against, every cleric in the Catholic Church, all the way up to the Pope at different times. Your average Catholic cleric, and I've written down a few descriptive words here, average would probably be drunk, overfed, unable to read the Bible, rarely in the office he was paid to be in, not celibate, meaning would have a wife, potentially mistresses, children. Big no-no for anyone in the Catholic Church and the church itself. The church also paid no taxes, and this is going to be very important for a lot of royal decisions to be made later on in regards to Catholic versus Protestant. So again, the Catholic Church pays no taxes, but they are the single largest landowner of both urban and farmland in most of these kingdoms. So again, they own the most land, but pay nothing to the ruler for the use of that land. Not terribly balanced. And eventually, monarchs are not going to enjoy that, and the Catholic Church is not going to care that they don't like it. They're still going to want to do it. So we have problems with that. We'll get to it. Henry VIII jumps to mind as an especially unkind monarch when it comes to the Catholic-Protestant split. The issues coming from the list mentioned above were not issues until the political leaders, again, the kings, princes, etc., realized that the imbalance of power was there and the imbalance of payment was there. Kings wanted control of the clerics, and the Catholic Church refused to relinquish that control. So, when Martin Luther lit the fuse of this change coming with his 95 Theses, he called out the church's abuses, but he knew that he was not the only one that felt this way, right? I mean, he wasn't just going to go and get himself excommunicated, which, by the way, he was. Please look through your PowerPoints that are on Blackboard as well. They have some great extra information about the guy. He was, pretty sure that a lot of people, especially people of influence, princes, dukes, etc., throughout the Holy Roman Empire, felt the same way, whether it was for religious reasons or fiscal reasons. He was pretty sure a lot of them felt that the church just had too much power. Well, he was correct. Luther preached also, not just, because he wanted these things changed, but he saw religion differently. He saw Christianity differently. He preached the sole source of religious truth was the Bible. So he had a heavy emphasis on being able to read the Bible for yourself, or felt that his followers ought to have the ability. So there was a greater increase in, a focus on literacy, which comes with this, very important. Around the same time, we're getting the printing press, introduced to Europe. So Gutenberg and the printing press, not his idea, originally from China, but Gutenberg adapts it, and the Europeans at this time, especially the Protestants, are seeing a great need for printing large amounts of religious texts, hymns, religious scriptures, etc., things to disseminate all of this information that they want to get out there. The printing press happens to be there, and conveniently enough, the two ideas marry up nicely. And you see a lot of Protestant literature getting printed on early printing presses. Very cool. So, Luther grew his political base after 1517 by bouncing around to different principalities within the Holy Roman Empire, and at various times there were between several hundred to 1,000 or more individual principalities through the Holy Roman Empire. They were not terribly united. There was, in fact, an emperor. Holy Roman Empire, you got to have an emperor for an empire, right? Well, his name was Charles V. He was influential in his own court. He could certainly raise an army, and he will in the very near future, on behalf of Catholics, as he was Catholic himself. Now, he was not happy about Martin Luther being in his kingdom. However, enough of those princes and dukes that controlled their own, powerhouses, city-states, small kingdoms, however you want to phrase that and look at it, all of those guys that were Protestant, or at least agreed with Martin Luther, agreed to take him in for years and years, protect him, and basically ensure that Charles V had no power to, he was an outlaw, sure, but the emperor was effectively powerless to do anything about it. More on the Holy Roman Empire and the Emperor Charles V. He was of a family line that is very influential through several different, different kingdoms, especially at this time in Europe. The family name is Habsburg, Hapsburg. He did not exercise unquestioned control over the principalities. Like I said, he was the emperor, but he was not the supreme, he did not have as much control as he would like to have. I'll put it that way. So Charles was no fan of having Luther there, but as I said before, was powerless to stop it. This new religion allowed many of the princes and later rulers of other countries to declare control over the land that the Catholic Church had previously had as their own. And again, the Catholic Church had a lot of land. So if the prince, we'll say, in charge of his principality, declares that he is now of the Protestant faith, he believes that Luther is correct, so he's a Lutheran, and he no longer follows the word of the Catholic Church. Well, all of that land that was the Catholics in his principality, he now feels is his to reclaim. Well, this is true of princes all the way up to kings of other countries, as we will get to. But Luther also knew that the appeal to all of the princes to get them to support him, what he really needed to do, again, Holy Roman Empire divided into a lot of different principalities at the time, but they all shared a common language, very Germanic language, German. They shared a common sense of being German. So while they knew that they were individual, Bavarians, etc., different principalities, they all felt a common core sense of being one people. Luther preached to that. He addressed we Germans. So he definitely knew what he was doing in a political sense and a religious sense. Let's see. By 1530, got ahead of myself, 1517 to 1529, you have Martin Luther and the princes just, Martin Luther bouncing around to different places, gaining support, spreading the word. Protestantism spreads very quickly amongst, especially the poorer people in society, because it gives them a direct connection to God. As we'll discuss with Lutheranism and his belief structure, it negates a lot of the clerics that the Catholic Church had put in between a soul's salvation and direct contact with, the supreme being. So Lutheranism, early Protestantism, removed that a bit and focused on, again, the Bible being the sole source, and we'll get to it in a moment. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself again. So 17 to 29, Luther is really developing his ideas. In 29, he and the princes have a little sit down and officially declared this, an idea. And this idea spreads very quickly, because 1 year later, 1530, much of the Holy Roman Empire and many of the Scandinavian kingdoms to the north of the Holy Roman Empire had converted to, Lutheranism, a Protestant way of thinking. So a lot of Catholics were getting kicked out. The Pope was not happy about this. This also, again, I mentioned him earlier, had a direct effect on how King Henry VIII of England saw his power at the time. So, in a nutshell, Henry liked being married. He liked wanting to be divorced even more. Eventually, this guy would have 6 wives. He has a very interesting story on how to get rid of or how each one of them died, got divorced, happened to get beheaded, or in one case, the last one survived him. But out of 6 wives, the big problem with the Catholic Church came with number one. Henry wanted to get divorced. The Pope said no. Well, this whole Protestant idea was going around at the time. And in the 1530s, again, Henry was a very prideful man, and his power base was building. And to exercise this as a new, powerful king, he basically tells the Pope that he doesn't care that he won't grant a divorce because England is separating from the papal see, from the church, from Rome. They are now going to be, as a country, independent from the Catholic Church. It is now going to be a Protestant nation headed by the monarch, headed by Henry himself. He is now the head of the Anglican Church, which is, again, the English spin-off of Protestantism. So, a small aside, he signed the separation with Rome in a friary called the Black Friar. So, that is a tube stop, subway stop in London today, the Blackfriars stop. If you get off there and walk just around the corner from the underground station, you will see the building still standing where Henry VIII signed the separation with Rome. It is now a pub called the Blackfriar Pub. Now, I recommend, if you're old enough, going in and enjoying yourself because it's a great pub. 2, you can go and sit in the same spot, theoretically, on the same boards that Henry sat on to sign the separation with Rome. Doesn't cost you a thing. You sign a sheet of paper. You have 1 hour allotted to you to go and sit in it. I recommend, if you're ever in London, give it a shot. It's a really cool place. Back to Henry VIII and his separation with the Catholic Church. As I mentioned, when he did this, he did it with flair and gusto. Okay, so it's one thing to separate from the church and go, okay, all of you guys that work for the Pope, get out, the land is ours. Sorry, all of these beautiful cathedrals and churches that you've built, I'm reclaiming them. I'm the king. We don't want you here anymore. Bye-bye. Henry did not do that. He tried. When people didn't leave, he had them hung. He had these cathedrals burned down, demolished, turned into bits of castle to glorify himself, lots of things that were not good for the Catholic Church. Also not good for the Catholics that stayed around. So, like I said, Henry converted England with gusto. For at least, and I would have to research this further to say if it's still true to this day, but Henry, as the founder of the Anglican Church, made a point to have all clerics in the Church of England, in his church, swear an oath of loyalty to the monarch. So the monarch, unlike in Catholicism, where the Pope is the head of the church, in the Anglican Church, you have the monarch as the head of the church. So Elizabeth I, she also agreed with this and, again, made all of the clerics in the Anglican Church sign, what amounts to just that, an oath of loyalty. So, big differences nonetheless. Another, and this goes into kind of the second generation, let's look at Martin Luther and Lutheranism as the first generation of Protestantism. This is what we're going to call the second generation. And the second generation of Protestantism centers around a thinker and a writer, a French man by the name of John Calvin. So Calvin, he's in your vocab list. He was born in 1509, died 1564. The book declares him the most influential second generation Protestant thinker. He preached that God was all powerful and man had no free will. So, if any of you are familiar with predestination, that is a Calvinist thought. It is adopted into many other religions now, I believe, or several other, but that was one of his early deviations from the Catholic Church and from Lutheranism as well. Calvin began, preaching his views in Geneva, Switzerland. But again, rather like Lutheranism, they spread very quickly. I think a lot of people were just very unhappy with the Catholic Church and all of the abuses at the time. Makes sense. I would have been too. So in Scotland, from the Calvinist side of things, you have the Scottish Presbyterian Church formed. You also have the group known as the French Huguenots, which, French Protestants, they are going to be persecuted, kicked out at various and sundry times. So remember, Huguenots. Calvin's influence would eventually be felt on both sides of the Atlantic in the Dutch and English colonies that were being formed just after, his death. And so again, very influential second generation thinker. He's also, his beliefs versus Luther's beliefs are in a link in the PowerPoint. I highly recommend reviewing that PowerPoint section. Just give it a shot. The Catholic Reformation was a direct response to the Protestant Reformation formation. In the 1530s, Pope Paul III decided to reform the church. Thus, he created the Holy Office, which is, I believe, still the highest court in Catholicism. And the council had very great powers. They could arrest and they could even execute people within the Catholic faith. The Holy Office met over several years from 1545 to 1563 in the city of Trent. Thus, those years, that meeting, that grouping of time became known as the Council of Trent. It was focused on bringing better practices to not only the people that were within the church, the clerics, but also the faithful, among the Catholics. But it was also designed to reassert the political dominance as well of Catholicism. So, Council of Trent, straighten some things out, reassert the church's power. Among the decisions made at the Council of Trent, some new clerical requirements of those Catholic priests and such. They dictated that priests must live in the area that they serve. So again, that was absenteeism, one of the big complaints. You also have kind of a refocus on addressing celibacy laws or celibacy rules within Catholicism, at least maybe not with the popes, but certainly at the lower levels. You have several of the religious orders, like the Ursuline nuns, form at this time, and that's from Angela Merici. I'm not entirely sure how to inflect that. I apologize. And this formation, again, the Ursuline nuns, sect of Catholicism, or I guess a practice within Catholicism. Won't call it a sect, that's rude. But there was a heavy focus on the education of women within this newly formed part of Catholicism. The group that would become known as the Bloodhounds of the Church, the Jesuit order, was formed there very shortly after, in 1540 by Ignatius Loyola. These people would become known as kind of the foot soldiers of spreading Catholicism. Whenever there was an exploration into Asia, South America, eventually Africa, anywhere that colonialism went, Jesuits went with them. That was their entire purpose. They went into local communities and started converting people from local practices to Catholicism. Now, retrospective history, we look at this as very bad. They looked at it as saving the souls of the people that they were going to convert, at least initially. A lot of the power that they gained in those conversions, the Catholics gained again the power back in these areas that the colonies formed in, amongst the locals. Now they would turn that into political power later on, and centuries down the line in Central and South America, we would see a lot of problems with that. Not in this class, though. So, I would really, subtitle this next section of your notes, Religious Violence. Beginning in 1546, the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor Charles V started to wage war on the local Protestant principalities and cities, a lot of those folks that had protected Martin Luther from 1517 to 1529. His early successes, which he had some, led to the French king, Protestant, to send some troops. And this is very much in a nutshell of this engagement. The French troops very much tipped the balance of power, and eventually, this is a years-long conflict, the Protestant forces took control and forced Charles to sign the Peace of Augsburg, Augsburg, in 1555. Now, this treaty, Peace of Augsburg, forced Charles to recognize that Lutheranism, that part of Protestantism, was in fact a legitimate religion. very important to those that followed Luther. It also forced Charles to allow those different principalities to make the decision. Were you going to be Catholic or were you going to be Protestant? You could now pick one and officially stick to it. And Charles, at least for the purposes of the Peace of Augsburg, said he would agree not to use his Catholic army to come and crush you. So the choice could now officially be made. You could choose between Protestantism and Catholicism. A year later, the Spanish/Dutch king, because Spain's crown controlled much of the Dutch Netherlands at this point, King Philip II, the son of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, was crowned under Charles' abdication. He was very embarrassed about the Peace of Augsburg, apparently. So he crowned his son, the Holy Roman Emperor, as well. So you have Philip II being in control of Spain, of the Dutch Netherlands, and now of what we know as Germany and a lot of that surrounding area. So, very important fella. French violence broke out. Sorry, to quick track into notes. Violence in France. Violence in France broke out in Paris on St. Bartholomew's Day, August 24th, in 1572. Now, this happened when misread my notes. When Catholics attacked Calvinists at a royal marriage of the king's sister. She happened to be Catholic, and the guy she was marrying, a fellow named Henry of Navarre, happened to be Protestant. Now, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre would kick off a 15-year-long civil war that, again, would kill many, many civilians in France, and really just a lot of political unrest at this time, y'all. The Dutch Netherlands would also see their fair share of violence, although that would turn into more of a civil war and a war of liberation from Spain as much as a religious conflict, but, has to start somewhere, right? So the Dutch Netherlands were largely under the control of the Spanish crown, and the very Catholic Spanish began to heavily tax the Dutch Calvinist. As I mentioned in class, as Americans, we're always familiar with the no taxation without representation, taxes are too high mindset, leading to our own revolution from our colonial powerhouse. Well, the Dutch were kind of starting to feel the same way, especially the Protestants that were being taxed too highly. So when that happened in the 1560s, roughly 1568 to 78, you had, again, kind of a civil war where it was the Spanish Dutch, the Dutch who were supported by Spain and took their, as their sovereign, Philip II at that point as their sovereign, versus the Dutch independents. And they fought over, again, many things, but differences in religious preference. From 1581 to 87, I keep misreading that. In 1581, you have 7 of the 17 kingdoms of the Dutch crown declare independence from Spain. So they formed the Union of Utrecht, and they fought on from 1609 for 28 years, finally forcing Spain to concede the northern powers the right to be Protestant. So again, the Dutch, war of, decolonization from Spanish control, paired with the religious violence that came with Catholics versus Protestants, was incredibly drawn out in the Dutch Netherlands. So, I'm about to end on this point. The Reformation also renewed focus on the more extreme aspects of Christianity. Witch trials became very popular in these decades, and at the height of the Inquisitions and witch trials, between the 16th and 17th centuries again, over 200,000 people, 80 to 90% of them women, were charged under witchcraft-related hearings, or charges, and then had hearings, and typically some torture related with that. The majority of these trials, at that level, when you had centralized government, you typically would fare better in the long run if you were charged in witchcraft, because what historians now understand is that a lot of times witch trials were centered around local power struggles between people, and typically if you charge someone as being a witch, or a practitioner of magic, dark magic at this time, they would be a social outcast, even if they got out of the local system, the local courts, and took that case all the way to a higher, more centralized court. Again, a higher, more centralized court, you're out of the local politics. A lot of times people that had been sent there on witchcraft charges would be, exonerated. However, even though they were exonerated in the higher court, frequently they would not be welcomed back into the community where they had been charged with witchcraft. So, again, real not good time in Europe, y'all. But either way, with that, the majority of those trials, like I said, if you had a centralized court, would end less with the death of those charged, but still their social outcast nature being assured. So, with that, I'm going to end this section of notes, and we'll pick back up Thursday.